There is a setting on your iPhone right now that most people have never once looked at, and if it's configured the wrong way, it is quietly handing your banking verification codes to a device you don't even own. I want to be precise about what I'm telling you here, because precision is exactly what's missing from most of the panic around this topic. This isn't one single mysterious switch that drains your bank account the moment it's flipped. It's a specific handful of iPhone settings, several of them buried deep enough that most people never stumble onto them by accident, that together determine whether a scammer who's already targeting you can actually succeed or hits a wall the moment they try. And right now, in 2026, this matters more than it has in years, because Apple itself issued a direct warning this year about a scam wave specifically built to exploit exactly this gap. Fake Apple Pay fraud alerts, followed by high-pressure phone calls, designed to walk you straight into draining your own account while you're convinced you're protecting it. In one documented case, a woman was talked all the way to the counter of her own bank, ready to withdraw $15,000 before a teller who recognized the pattern stopped her in time. Let me walk you through exactly which settings matter, why each one matters specifically, and how to lock every one of them down in the next 5 minutes. Let's start with the actual scam driving all of this urgency, because understanding the attack is what makes every single setting fix that follows make sense, rather than feeling like a random checklist. According to Apple's own guidance and reporting from consumer protection researchers, this specific wave surged across the United States and Europe earlier this year, and it works almost entirely through psychology rather than any technical hack. It typically starts with a text message that looks completely official, a claim that there's been a suspicious charge on your Apple Pay account or that your account has been locked for security reasons. The message includes a phone number to call. If you're worried, and the whole point of the message is to make you worried, you call it. But you're not reaching Apple. You're reaching a scammer, often posing as a fraud investigator or security specialist. And from there, the entire interaction is built around one goal: creating enough panic that you'll follow instructions without stopping to question them, sometimes ending with a victim being talked into physically withdrawing large sums of cash, believing they're moving it to safety. Apple has been direct and specific about how to recognize this pattern, and it's worth repeating exactly what they've said, because it's the single most reliable piece of information in this entire topic. Apple will never ask you to log into any website, will never ask you to tap accept on a two-factor authentication prompt over the phone, will never ask for your password, your device passcode, or your two-factor authentication code, and will never ask you to read that code aloud or type it into any website or form. If any call, text, or email asks you to do any of those things while claiming to represent Apple, your bank, or basically any legitimate financial institution, that request itself is the scam, regardless of how convincing the surrounding message looks. Scammers have also specifically been documented asking victims to disable security features first, under the guise of helping resolve the supposed problem, which is precisely why the settings we're about to walk through matter so much. A scammer talking you through disabling your own protections over the phone is a real documented tactic, not a hypothetical worst case. So let's get into the actual settings, because this is where you go from understanding the threat to actually closing the specific gaps a scammer, or honestly, anyone else who gets physical access to your unlocked phone, could exploit. The first thing to check lives inside your Settings app. Under General, then Autofill and Passwords. Scroll down toward the bottom of that section, and you'll find a setting related to automatically deleting verification codes once they've been used. When your banco texts you a one-time login code, that code is only meant to be useful for a single login attempt, and most codes expire within 10 to 15 minutes regardless. But if that code sits in your Messages app indefinitely after you've already used it, it becomes a piece of sensitive information sitting in plain text, readable by anyone who gains access to your phone or your messages, whether through a stolen device, a compromised iCloud account, or a scammer who's already talked you into handing over more access than you realized. Turning this setting on means iOS automatically clears used verification codes, rather than letting them accumulate as a growing archive of your own security history. The second setting is one of the most overlooked in this entire list, and it directly relates to that scam pattern of talking someone into handing over more access than they realize: text message forwarding. Inside Settings, tap Apps, then scroll to Messages, and look for text message forwarding. This setting controls which other Apple devices, a Mac, an iPad, another iPhone, signed into the same Apple ID, also receive copies of your text messages, including, critically, any verification code your bank sends you. If you own multiple Apple devices yourself, some of these toggles being on is completely normal and expected. But this is exactly the setting worth checking carefully after any situation where you're not entirely sure every device signed into your Apple ID is genuinely still in your possession, or after any interaction where someone else asked you to help them verify something using your Apple ID. If a device you don't recognize or don't currently have physical control over is listed here and toggled on, that device is receiving your banking verification codes in real time at the exact same moment you are, without you necessarily noticing anything unusual on your own screen. The third setting addresses a completely different kind of exposure, what shows up on your lock screen before you've even unlocked your phone. Go to Settings, then Notifications, then scroll down to find your specific banking app. Most people leave notification previews set to always, which means the full content of a notification, a deposit amount, a purchase alert, a balance update, displays directly on your lock screen for anyone standing nearby to read, without needing your passcode or your face at all. That's a completely different risk category than the scam call scenario, closer to old-fashioned shoulder surfing than social engineering, but it's a genuinely real one, especially for anyone whose phone spends time on a desk, in a shared space, or anywhere else it might be visible to someone else even briefly. Switching that specific app's preview setting to Never means you'll still get notified that something happened, a badge, a sound, an entry in your notification history once unlocked, but the actual sensitive detail stays hidden until you deliberately unlock your device and open the app yourself. The fourth setting is genuinely one of the most important on this entire list, and it's the one most directly relevant to preventing unauthorized access, even if someone else briefly gets hold of your unlocked device or guesses your passcode. Requiring Face ID specifically for your banking apps, layered on top of whatever login the bank itself already requires. Inside Settings, go to Face ID and Passcode. Enter your passcode to access that section, and look for a list of apps under a heading related to using Face ID for additional app protection. Individual apps, including most major banking apps, appear in that list with their own toggle. Turning this on for your banking app means that even if someone has your unlocked phone directly in their hands, or somehow knows your device passcode, they still cannot open your banking app without your actual face successfully authenticating, adding a genuinely meaningful extra barrier specifically around your most sensitive financial information, separate from whatever general device security you already have in place. The fifth and final setting worth checking addresses what remains accessible on your phone even while it's fully locked, which is a genuinely easy thing to overlook because it feels like it shouldn't matter if the phone is locked in the first place. From the main settings screen, find the section covering what's accessible from the lock screen and specifically look for wallet access. If this is enabled, someone holding your locked phone can access stored payment cards and potentially initiate payments without ever actually unlocking the device at all. Turning this off means wallet access requires a full unlock first. It's genuinely worth reviewing every other item in that same lock screen access list with the same mindset. For each one, ask whether you actually need that specific feature to work without a full unlock, or whether requiring your passcode or Face ID first is a completely acceptable trade-off for a meaningfully more secure phone. For most people, turning off as many lock screen shortcuts as reasonably possible is the right default, since anything accessible without unlocking is, by definition, accessible to anyone who simply picks up your phone. Now let's connect these settings directly back to the actual scam scenario Apple warned about earlier this year, because understanding exactly how these pieces fit together is what turns this from a generic security checklist into a genuinely effective defense against the specific threat currently circulating. In the documented pattern, a scammer's entire strategy depends on convincing you, through manufactured urgency and fear, to either hand over information directly or to take an action, like withdrawing cash or approving a prompt, that they cannot force through any technical means on their own. None of the 5 settings above can stop a convincing phone call from being convincing. What they can do is close off the secondary paths a scammer might exploit if they manage to get further than a phone call. Making sure a verification code doesn't sit around indefinitely where it could be read later, making sure that code isn't quietly forwarding to a device outside your control, making sure your financial notifications aren't broadcasting sensitive numbers to anyone glancing at your lock screen, making sure your banking app itself requires your face, even if someone else gets your phone directly in their hands, and making sure a locked phone genuinely stays locked rather than leaving payment methods one tap away. I want to spend a moment on the psychological mechanics of the actual scam itself, because understanding why it works is arguably more protective than any single setting, since the settings only help if the scam gets further than it should. Consumer protection researchers who've studied this specific wave have been direct about the core mechanism. It works specifically because it manufactures panic, and panic is a state that reliably makes people worse at evaluating whether a request actually makes sense. A message claiming your account has been compromised triggers an immediate visceral urgency to fix the problem right now, and that urgency is precisely what scammers are counting on to short-circuit the normal, healthy skepticism you'd apply to an unfamiliar request under calmer circumstances. The documented case of a woman being talked to the edge of Withdrawing $15,000 in cash, stopped only because an alert bank teller recognized the pattern, illustrates exactly how far that manufactured panic can carry someone who is, under any normal circumstance, a careful and reasonable person. So, beyond the phone settings themselves, there's a behavioral safeguard worth building into your own habits that matters just as much as anything found in a settings menu. If you ever receive an unexpected message or call claiming to be from Apple, your bank, or any financial institution, warning you about a security problem and providing a phone number or link to resolve it, do not call that number or click that link, no matter how official it looks or how urgent it sounds. Instead, independently look up your bank's actual customer service number from the back of your physical card, from their official app, or from their verified website, and call that number directly yourself. If there's a genuine problem with your account, that legitimate channel will know about it and can verify it properly. If there isn't, you've just avoided walking directly into a scammer's script without ever needing to figure out in the moment whether the message you received was real or fake. It's also worth understanding a specific detail Apple has emphasized directly, because it's one of the clearest, most reliable tells available. Apple does not use high-pressure tactics, and Apple does not ask you to disable your own security features as part of resolving a support issue. If a caller claiming to represent Apple, your bank, or any similar institution asks you to turn off Face ID, disable two-factor authentication, or walk through any of the settings covered in this video in the opposite direction, turning protections off rather than on, that request alone should function as a hard stop. Legitimate support interactions do not require you to make yourself more vulnerable in order to fix a problem. That single, simple rule cuts through an enormous amount of the manufactured complexity these scams rely on to keep victims following instructions without stopping to question them. Let me also address something worth being fair and precise about, because it matters for keeping this genuinely useful rather than needlessly alarming. None of these 5 settings represent some kind of hidden flaw or intentional vulnerability built into the iPhone. They're simply defaults that prioritize convenience over maximum security, which is a completely reasonable default for the vast majority of everyday phone use. Text message forwarding exists specifically because it's genuinely useful to read messages across multiple devices you own. Notification previews exist because most of the time, seeing what a notification says at a glance is exactly what you want. The issue is never that these features are inherently dangerous. It's that most people have never been walked through the specific handful of them that matter most once banking and financial apps enter the picture, and scammers are counting on that gap in awareness far more than they're counting on exploiting any actual flaw in Apple's security engineering. Let's talk about who this specific scam wave has been targeting most aggressively, because understanding the targeting pattern helps explain why this deserves genuine attention right now, rather than being filed away as one more generic warning you've already heard a version of. Reports on this specific campaign describe it as surging simultaneously, convince every single recipient. A message sent broadly enough only needs to land with a small percentage of recipients who happen to be genuinely uncertain about their account status, distracted, or simply having a stressful day. When the message arrives, for the campaign to be financially worthwhile for the people running it. That's precisely why these messages are engineered to look as routine and official as possible, mimicking exactly the kind of legitimate fraud alert Apple or a bank might genuinely send, rather than the more obviously suspicious phishing attempts most people have already learned to recognize and dismiss. It's also worth understanding the broader pattern this specific Apple Pay scam fits into, because it isn't an isolated technique invented from nothing. Security researchers, tracking phone-based social engineering more broadly, have documented a wide range of related tactics throughout this year, including scammers using FaceTime calls specifically to add a layer of apparent legitimacy to their impersonation, and separate campaigns using fraudulent emails that appear to originate directly from Apple's own systems, sometimes convincingly enough, to bypass standard email security filtering entirely. In one documented case, attackers sent fake purchase notification emails from infrastructure that allowed the message to pass authentication checks that would normally flag an obvious forgery, then directed recipients toward a fake support number specifically to begin the same underlying panic and pressure sequence. The specific delivery method keeps shifting. A text one month, an email the next, a FaceTime call after that. But the underlying psychological playbook stays remarkably consistent across nearly every variation. Manufacture urgency around your financial security, then exploit that urgency to either extract information directly or talk you into taking an action you would never take under calmer circumstances. I want to walk through the mechanics of the text message forwarding setting in a bit more detail, because I think it deserves more attention than it typically gets, given how directly it connects to banking verification codes specifically. When you set up a new Apple device using the same Apple ID as your iPhone, text message forwarding can be enabled during that setup process, sometimes without much deliberate thought given to exactly what that means for security going forward. Over months or years, it's genuinely common for people to accumulate old devices, still technically signed into their Apple ID, a previous iPad handed down to a family member, an old Mac sitting in a closet, a device that was sold or given away without properly signing out of the associated Apple account first. Each of those devices, if still listed and toggled on under text message forwarding, continues receiving copies of your text messages indefinitely, including any banking verification code sent to your phone number, regardless of whether you still have any practical control over that specific device, or even remember it still exists. This is exactly the kind of gap that doesn't require a sophisticated scammer at all. It simply requires an old device falling into the wrong hands, still fully authorized to receive your most sensitive incoming messages because nobody ever went back and cleaned up that specific setting. There's a similar logic worth applying to the Face ID setting for individual apps, because it's worth understanding exactly why this particular protection matters, even for people who already use a strong device passcode. A device passcode protects your phone as a whole, but once that passcode is entered correctly by you or by anyone else who knows it or observes you entering it, every app on the device becomes accessible by default, unless you've specifically added an additional layer on top. Requiring Face ID separately for banking apps means that layer of protection doesn't collapse the moment your general passcode is compromised or observed. This matters especially for anyone who shares a household with others, as children who know the general device passcode for legitimate reasons, or has ever had their phone briefly out of their direct control in a public setting. It's a genuinely small amount of additional friction, a fraction of a second longer to open your banking app, in exchange for a real, meaningful additional barrier, specifically around your most sensitive financial information. Let's also address the notification preview and lock screen wallet settings in a bit more practical depth, because both of these protect against a meaningfully different threat model than the phone call scam. And understanding that distinction helps explain why both are still worth fixing, even if you feel confident you'd never fall for a fraudulent phone call. Notification previews and lockout screen wallet access don't require any social engineering at all. They only require physical proximity to your device, someone glancing at your phone on a table, a coworker walking past your desk, a stranger picking up a phone left briefly unattended in a public place. That's a fundamentally different risk than a scammer calling from another country, and it's one that a strong passcode and Face ID for individual apps doesn't fully address on its own, since notification previews and certain lock screen features are specifically designed to work without requiring any unlock at all. Closing those two gaps protects against a quieter, more mundane risk than the dramatic phone call scam, but it's a genuinely real one, and it costs nothing beyond the few seconds it takes to adjust each setting. It's worth doing a final pass through your specific banking and financial apps individually, rather than assuming a single general device setting covers all of them at once, because both the notification preview setting and the Face ID app specific setting are configured separately for each individual app, rather than applying universally across your entire phone. If you use more than one banking app, a primary checking account app, and a separate investment or brokerage app, for instance, each one needs to be checked and adjusted individually. It's genuinely easy to secure one banking app thoroughly while completely overlooking a second one that receives just as much sensitive financial information simply because it wasn't the first app that came to mind while working through this list. Take the extra minute to open your full app list inside both the notification settings and the Face ID app list. And specifically, look for every single app connected to your money, not just the one you use most often day to day. Here's your complete action list, condensed down to exactly what to check and in what order, so you can run through this in the next few minutes rather than needing to rewatch this entire explanation while you do it. First, settings, general, autofill and passwords, and confirm automatic verification code deletion is turned on. Second, settings, apps, messages, text message forwarding, and confirm every device listed is genuinely yours and currently in your possession, removing access for anything you don't recognize or no longer control. Third, settings, notifications. Find each of your banking and financial apps individually and switch notification previews to never. Fourth, settings, Face ID and passcode. Enter your passcode and turn on Face ID specifically for every banking and financial app listed. Fifth, from the main settings screen, review what's accessible from your lock screen without a full unlock, and specifically turn off wallet access, along with anything else on that list you don't have a genuine, specific reason to keep available without unlocking first. And beyond the settings themselves, the single behavioral rule worth internalizing above everything else covered here. Any unexpected message or call creating urgency around your financial accounts gets verified independently through a phone number or app you looked up yourself, never through. Contact information provided inside the message that triggered your concern in the first place. That one habit on its own defeats the entire mechanism this specific scam wave depends on, regardless of how convincing any individual message happens to look. I also want to walk through what a legitimate Apple Pay or bank security interaction actually looks like, since knowing the genuine version makes the fake version far easier to spot in the moment. If Apple Pay genuinely detects suspicious activity, the notification comes through Apple's own system, visible directly inside the wallet app itself, not as a standalone text message asking you to call an external number. Similarly, if your bank genuinely needs to reach you about suspicious activity, that contact typically comes through channels you've already established with them directly, an alert inside their official app, a call from a number that matches their published customer service line, or a secure message inside your online banking portal, rather than a cold text message providing its own separate phone number for you to call. The moment any message asks you to reach out through a channel it provides itself, rather than directing you back to a channel you already know and trust, that's a structural red flag worth treating with real suspicion, regardless of how urgent or official the surrounding language sounds. It's also worth addressing directly why bank tellers and financial institutions have started training staff specifically to watch for this exact pattern, because it tells you something important about how seriously this is being taken on the institutional side, not just among individual consumers. The documented case of a woman being stopped before withdrawing $15,000 wasn't luck. It reflects a deliberate response from banks that have seen this specific pattern. A customer arriving distressed, insisting on a large cash withdrawal, describing a phone call about protecting their money from fraud, often enough times that many institutions now train frontline staff to recognize those specific warning signs and ask gentle, clarifying questions before processing an unusually large cash withdrawal under those circumstances. That institutional safeguard is a genuinely valuable last line of defense, but it depends entirely on a scam getting far, enough to reach a bank counter in the first place, and on a specific teller happening to recognize the pattern in that specific moment. Locking down the settings covered here, combined with the habit of independently verifying any urgent financial message, is what prevents you from ever needing that last line of defense to work correctly on your behalf in the first place. There's one more dimension worth covering, because it addresses a question that naturally comes up once you understand how convincing these scam messages can look. How do you actually verify whether a specific text or email is genuinely from Apple or your bank without falling into the trap of using contact information the suspicious message itself provided? For anything claiming to be from Apple specifically, the safest approach is opening settings directly on your device and checking your Apple ID account status yourself, since any genuine account issue would be reflected there, visible through a channel you navigated to independently, rather than through a link or number someone sent you. For anything claiming to be from your bank, log into your account through the official app you already have installed, or through a web address you type in yourself rather than clicking any link in the message. And check your account status and any alerts directly from inside that verified, self-initiated login. If nothing appears there matching what the suspicious message claimed, you've confirmed it was fraudulent without ever needing to engage with the scammers provided contact information at all, and without needing to make a judgment call in the heat of the moment about whether a particular message looks convincing enough to trust. I also want to address the emotional dimension of this topic directly, because I think it's genuinely more important than any individual technical setting. These scams work specifically by targeting a moment of fear about your own financial security, and that fear is completely understandable and human. Nobody should feel embarrassed or foolish for having felt genuine panic upon receiving a message claiming their account had been compromised. That's precisely the reaction these messages are engineered to produce in anyone, regardless of how careful or technically savvy they normally are. The goal here was never to suggest that falling for a moment of panic reflects poorly on someone's judgment. It's to make sure that moment of panic, if it ever happens to you, runs into a wall of settings and habits that keep it from turning into an actual financial loss, giving you the breathing room to slow down, verify independently, and recognize the pattern before any real damage occurs. None of this requires any special technical expertise, and none of it takes more than a few minutes once you know exactly where to look. What it requires is actually doing it today, rather than assuming your phone was already configured this way by default, because for the overwhelming majority of iPhone users, it wasn't. These settings sit exactly where Apple left them the day you first set up your phone, optimized for everyday convenience rather than for the specific, sharpened threat currently circulating against banking apps and Apple Pay users right now. Closing that gap is genuinely a 5-minute task. Leaving it open is what a documented, active, currently surging scam campaign is specifically counting on.